So I've noticed a pattern recently of commentators, public figures, who feel very strongly about Israel and defending Israel and Israel's, quote, right to defend itself. That it sort of sends them into this spiral where all of a sudden they're fighting against their own fan base on something that they think their fan base should recognize as an obvious righteous position. But it seems to be turning them against their fan base instead. And so it creates this kind of downward spiral where the behavior gets pretty unhinged on the part of the public figures. In a way, understandably, because they are, in their mind, detecting anti-Semitism. And we'll get into all that. The two people that I want to point to specifically are Klein and Michal Rapaport. Two very different guys that I'm aware of for very different reasons. Klein has been an internet fixture for a long time. He used to do like content court and silly online content about vaping and stuff like that. But pretty well-known figure. And then he had this moment where he was moving to the left, and I still think that he's a pretty center-left figure in general. But he wanted to be a part of the left. He wanted to be a part of, good information spreading on the left and countering the bad information that spreads on the right. And so he was working with Hassan Piker, one of the biggest public figures on the left, or I'll say one of the biggest alternative media figures on the left. So they were working together under this, I guess, precarious pretense that they agreed on most things. And they seemed to, because they were talking more about culture war issues, And that's the kind of thing, countering Ben Shapiro, countering Candace Owens, that sort of thing. That's the kind of thing that Ethan can get behind, both because it's not super challenging to his politics as they exist, and also it fits into his skill set of going after other content creators and kind of picking them apart. So there was kind of an allegiance there between Hassan and Ethan, and I guess they were also friends. So that's one example. And then you also have Michal Rapaport, who's been around for a long time. He's had some ties with hip-hop culture and comedy, and he's been in movies and stuff like that. I'm not that familiar with his catalog, but I've been aware of him for a long time. He's a person who had a decent amount of celebration within the hip-hop community, just because he'd kind of been around, and he has a very sort of abrasive way of making himself known, of speaking his opinions, and I think people in the hip-hop world appreciate that, as well as always feeling like he was kind of speaking up for them and coming to their, defense, I guess, coming to their aid, coming to the support of hip-hop culture as a whole. And so that's valuable, especially when you're loud spoken and outspoken. So, he was a guy that a lot of people had a lot of appreciation for, and I'm sure some still do. But both of these figures took pretty hard turns, at the start of this whole Hamas versus Israel thing, at least the latest iteration of it that so-called started on October 7th, although that wasn't really the start of anything, but it was a major event that, has led to all of the destruction and obliteration that we have seen in Gaza perpetrated by Israel since then. And so both of these guys, Michal Rapaport and Klein, they have very different positions on it, and I don't want to conflate their positions. I'm really just comparing them because of the dynamic that I see this issue creating between them and their audience. And for the most part, I'll put Michal Rapaport to the side. I don't have as much to say about him because his perspective on Israel-Palestine is just pretty atrocious. I mean, it's pretty much right in line with the most evil things that you hear from the most ardent Israel supporters, that Palestinians are essentially worthless, that they deserve what they're getting, that Israel is defending itself in its, bloodthirsty genocide of Gaza, and that any criticism of that horrific military action is anti-Semitic, etc. And so he's on a warpath about that and appears to just be kind of off the deep end when it comes to the pro-Israeli perspective, as genocidal as that has become. So we'll get back to that. But Ethan is in a more reasonable position when it comes to it, comes to this Israel-Palestine issue. However, there's a sticking point that he doesn't seem to quite be able to untangle himself from. And it's causing a lot of attention around him and his positions on Palestine, when really it's actually not that extreme. He's not like an extreme supporter of Israel or a Zionist or anything, and he has been frustrated by the fact that he gets lumped in as a Zionist and is one of the people that is, I don't know what the best way to say it, but pointing out that Zionist is kind of a way to lump Jews together in a way that can feel sort of anti-Semitic. And I don't fully agree with that. I think in some cases it's definitely true. People on sort of fringes of various political groups or whatever will use the word Zionist or like Zio in a way that's kind of creepy. But on a more substantive basis, Ethan doesn't really seem to understand why he gets lumped in as a Zionist, because he's not somebody that believes that, Israel has a right to colonize that land and that all Jews should move there and to hell with the Palestinians, etc. He does not seem to be a supporter of Israel in that sense. However, what he has said about the issue, and this gets into two-state versus one-state solutions, which is not, it's not my area of expertise. I'm not going to speak on that too long. But Ethan's position is that talking about a one-state solution is a non-starter because, in his view, from what he's seen, being in Israel, knowing Israelis, he believes that Israelis will never give up their country, and that any kind of talk or mention of a one-state solution to them is equivalent to genocide of the Jews, because they view the people that they have walled themselves off from and are now genociding in Gaza, they view them as genocidal, and that if that wall were to come down, they would be subject to mass slaughter and lose all their land, etc. So he, I guess, essentially advocates for a two-state solution, meaning that Palestinians have the right to their own self-determination, Israel has the right to its self-determination, and they essentially remain separate. And there would be some kind of land negotiation between that. Now, neither of these solutions are simple, but the one-state solution, the reason that people are looking towards that, or, Hassan, in the words of Hassan, he said he used to be a supporter of two-state solution, and he's changed his mind. And the core of that is that Israel is a fundamentally non-democratic state. It sort of pretends to be democratic, but it's truthfully more of an apartheid system. You can't vote in Israel. You don't have a say unless you are a Jew. And so, fundamentally, this is an anti-democratic process. It's an anti-democratic practice. This is an ethno-state. So, while on one hand, I think that it's valid for Ethan to assess that as things currently stand, Israelis in Israel would rather die, they would rather go out fighting than give up their sovereign ethno-state of Israel. So he's not saying that that's his position, that he believes that, but he's saying there's nothing you could ever say or do that would get them to relent on that. So to me, that's a little bit too much like appeasement. And I think it's also kind of a flawed argument, because you could point to various oppressive structures of various societies that came tumbling down and say that they seemed permanent, slavery in America, then Jim Crow in America, or apartheid Africa, and things like that, and none of these places have become utopias, especially in terms of race, since the downfalls of these various systems. But before those systems themselves fell, you had people who definitely would have said the same thing, that they would rather die. They'll never give us up. They'll never give up their slaves. They'll never give up their plantation. Guess what? They didn't have a choice. And so that was what I heard being argued by Hassan against Ethan, is that, first of all, the socioeconomic conditions have to change essentially over the decades in order for Israel to be forced to topple its oppressive apartheid system, at very least. And so whether this means Israel continues to exist as Israel, whether it becomes something else, all that doesn't really matter. Because at the core of this, not to say that it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter yet. Because first, we've got to, there's got to be a ceasefire. There's got to be meaningful reparations, both of which Ethan Klein agrees with. So that's good. He does not think Palestinians should continue to be obliterated. And he does not believe that, nothing good has ever come out of Gaza or Rafah, and therefore the complete leveling of those places by Israel is justified, which is the position of Michael Rapaport. So Ethan doesn't believe that stuff. But the point that was a sticking point for him that he wasn't able to concede is that the one-state solution is a non-starter, which, when you put it in those terms, sounds reasonable, except for when you really drill down, what he's saying there is that Israelis would never be willing to give up their ethno-state, and so that's the beginning of the negotiation. Because that's a completely unreasonable condition. And you could argue that assertion, given that the Jews and the Israelis are there because that colony was given to them by the British, you could argue that refusal to give up an ethno-state is the cause of what we are seeing happen in that region, and not a feature of what we're seeing happen in that region. That's just something I'm throwing out there, not really something I'm in the position to flesh out as an argument. But I do think it's a valid point that if you're not willing to address that the core of this society, that you are crediting Israelis with having the heart to never relinquish under any circumstances, they will never relinquish this land and this sovereignty. At the core of that society is just fundamentally anti-democratic practice. And so I think, and Ethan has said something similar to this, that essentially the Palestinians are the ones who should have the most say here in terms of their self-determination. They deserve reparations, and a lot of reparations. And in my view, maybe not as much Ethan's, I think that what happens with the state of Israel-Palestine should be more up to the Palestinians than the Israelis. Doesn't mean the Israelis shouldn't get a say, and that doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't mean that they have no claim to that land at all and should be expelled. That's not what I think. There are probably some people way further to the left of me on that issue that think that, and that's fine. And that's the kind of thing that Ethan is taking issue with as anti-Semitic, and we'll get to that. But the point is that the Palestinians are the ones who need to be made whole in this situation. And the fact that the colony of Israel exists as it does, and so that means it needs to continue to exist as it does, that doesn't hold water. And that doesn't mean I want to see all-out war going on between Palestinians and Israelis, but I mean, right now what you have is very asymmetrical warfare taking place on the part of Israel against Palestine. So already we are seeing the genocidal nature of Israelis, and it is not a result of Palestinians, trying to take their land. That's not what we're seeing. This is not self-defense that we're seeing from Israel. It is 100% offense. They are trying to obliterate as many Palestinians and as much civilization in Palestine as they possibly can. And they're using anything they can as a pretense for that. Hamas is using human shields. Hamas is hiding there, here. We have to blow up the hospitals. We have to blow up the schools, the universities. We have to blow it all up because it's all Hamas. And so you don't really need to even see the type of international pressure that would be necessary for Israel to relent its apartheid system. You don't even need to see that type of pressure befalling Israelis for them to be willing to resort to all-out, bloodthirsty warfare in order to get what they want, which is sovereignty of Israel. So we're already at that point. And to me, it seems to me that Israel is in a position that it doesn't necessarily have the right to do whatever it wants militarily and claim that it's because they have the right to claim their own land. That land was given to them. And so while I do understand the argument of Jews having a place to be that is theirs, that they can protect themselves from the rest of the world, given what happened in World War II, I understand that argument. I'm sympathetic to it. But they are not the ones in the moral high ground when it comes to Israel-Palestine. They're just not. And so the solution of Israel having its own state that is a straightforward apartheid state, that's no solution at all. And so starting from that position, if you're Ethan Klein, whether you realize it or not, you're putting yourself fundamentally at odds with what actually being progressive and actually being left-wing means. And so he waded into waters and he wanted to coexist in a culture that he didn't really realize his fundamental beliefs don't go deep enough to support. And that's where I want to draw the comparison between him and Rapaport, because you could say the same within hip-hop culture of Michael Rapaport. And amongst hip-hop culture, you don't see a lot of speaking up over Palestine, not as much as you should. But what you do see is when a guy like Michael Rapaport makes his genocidal opinions abundantly clear, he gets a ton of backlash over it. And, suddenly he's placed at odds with the rest of his audience, because I think both him and Ethan Klein were unaware of the extent to which they're, essentially part of their identity, not as Jews, but as Israelis. Ethan Klein being somebody who has lived there, and Michael Rapaport being somebody who he clearly has some ties to Israel. I would say probably beyond just his religion. I don't think religion is as much of a factor here, in my personal opinion, as your actual allegiance to the nation of Israel. Those are two different things. But opposing people for supporting the nation of Israel, which Ethan Klein did do in his rhetoric. He split a lot more hairs than Michael Rapaport did, but he essentially is saying that we need to defer to the refusal of Israelis to give up their colonized apartheid state. And so, that deference to Israel is what sets him apart with this more left-wing audience that he has built. And same could be said for Michael Rapaport in the hip-hop world. And to be honest with you, it's probably the case that Michael Rapaport was receiving actual anti-Semitism, because there is anti-Semitism within the hip-hop world. I would say more so than in the sort of left-wing politics world. Ethan Klein says that, you have these radical leftists and you have all this anti-Semitism on the left. And I think there's probably some. But you also have to recognize that a lot of the analysis or the critiques that are coming from people that you could claim are anti-Semitic, they're actually coming from a fundamental basis of the Israeli settlement is a non-democratic state. And, it flies in the face of democratic principles of all kinds. And so for it to be broadcasting itself as the beacon of democracy in the Middle East is absurd. And so my point being that if you have anti-Semitism coming from the left, or what you identify as anti-Semitism coming from the left, it's probably based in in an analysis of how the world works, an economic, power balance based analysis of how the world works. When it comes to the hip hop community, I don't think there's always that much sophistication. I think that there's just more actual anti-Semitism in that world. And so I wouldn't say that either of these guys are lying about having faced anti-Semitism in response to their positions on Israel. But what they don't realize is that that's not the cause. That's not the root of the issue here. The root of the issue is that supporting Israel in its current state and in its current actions is the immoral position. And while it may seem to you that you are taking the unpopular opinion for righteous reasons against your audience so that you can tell your family and your grandkids that you fought anti-Semitism, that's all well and good. Except anti-Semitism is actually not the prevailing issue when it comes to Israel-Palestine. The Jews are not at the bottom of the oppression cycle that is happening in the Middle East. And I'm not saying that they're not victims of anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that there's not anti-Semitism amongst Gazans, because that's often what Israelis and Zionists point to in justifying their own genocidal sentiments, is look at the genocidal sentiments of these people over here. And I'm not denying that. But what I am saying is that when you blow up the universities and schools of this region and you obliterate an entire generation of children's families and ability to learn, the idea that these people are going to become connected with some broader sense of liberalism and inclusivism and be able to understand why it's wrong to connect the conditions that they are being brought up in, the horrible, oppressive conditions that they are being brought up in, to connect that to the religion of individuals and to hate Jews because of it is wrong. You're destroying an entire generation of people's ability to ever even have the information to come to that conclusion. That's what Israel's doing. And it's been doing it for a long time. So their actions, as the ones who are more powerful and by far have the outsized power balance in that region, they're doing nothing but creating the conditions where these people are going to continue to hate them and to continue to feel that the only path to self-actualization, self-determination for them and their families and their loved ones is by hating and raging against Israel. So that's about the size of it, I think. I think that Ethan Klein is not fundamentally a bad guy. But I think that he doesn't realize that even his sort of hair-splitting position on Israel, I think, positions him against what is morally righteous. And as much as he wants to focus on anti-Semitism, and as much as Zionists of all stripes want to focus on anti-Semitism as the sort of fundamental oppressing force that's happening here, that's not holding water. People aren't buying that. And if anything, it's cheapening the urgency of the real problem of anti-Semitism. You know, conflating criticisms of Israel and criticisms of Zionism with anti-Semitism, it cheapens what anti-Semitism actually is, which is a disgusting form of hatred that's tied up in all kinds of racial tropes and things that are not attached to reality. So then when you take people pointing out things that are happening and power dynamics that are real and oppression that is taking place, murder that is taking place every day, you take people who are pointing at that and you call that anti-Semitism. Well, then calling out anti-Semitism then becomes the tool of the oppressors. And I think that's bad. And I think while I respect Ethan Klein's decision to be vigilant about anti-Semitism, I think he's missing the plot, and that's causing people to accuse him of being Islamophobic. And I think that he is in a position where he has a lot of preconceived biases, etc., that amount to Islamophobia by coming from a more Israeli perspective.